most of you, if you buy a house, and of course buying a house is not as popular as it once was, but if you do, you'll probably finance it through a lending institution. 15-year loan, 30-year loan. The 30-year loan, you pay less a month, you pay more in the long run. The 15-year loan, you pay a whole lot less in the long run. Depends on whether you think you're going to live in a certain place for 30 years or not. But anyway, banks, very important. Now, there's the territory that we had taken from the British. Now, I'm talking about the Northwest Territory. The states of Ohio, what is today Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Those 5 states east of the Mississippi, north of the Ohio, but west of Pennsylvania and west of Virginia. These 5 states were called the Northwest Territory. No, it did not include Kentucky and Tennessee. At first, they wanted to make these territories into slave states. Now, they began to organize for statehood, and this Constitution says any territory can become a state. Now, folks, this has obviously been changed when it has 5,000 male voters. In other words, when it had 5,000 men who owned property, they could apply for statehood. Now, obviously, that has been changed. But these territories were about to apply for statehood. At first, they were going to make them into slave states. But then they changed it and made them into free states because too many people living north did not want slavery in these new territories. Now, in the case of Georgia, they tried to start Georgia off as a non-slave state, but that didn't work. But Georgia was a southern state. Nobody moved into Georgia until they made slavery legal. I mean, this is fact. But the people began moving into the territories of Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan. A lot of white people moved in, and the Indians came into conflict. And again, the conflict was inevitable, because when the whites moved in, they moved in with their axes. They take their axes and chop down trees, pulling up the stumps. I mean, anyone know anything about this kind of farming? Pulling up the stumps was extremely hard, so let the stumps sit there and rot, and eventually get them out. But they plant their gardens between the tree stumps. Plow and put their seed down and plant their gardens between the tree stumps. And the result was, though, they came into conflict with the Indians. There were Indian uprisings. The white man fought against the Indians, and initially, the whites sent a man named Governor St. Clair. Governor St. Clair was the governor of Ohio. He engaged the Indians, and this time the Indians won. Surprise, surprise. But it was a temporary victory. The central government at Washington sent one of the Revolutionary War generals, a man named Anthony Wayne. They called him Mad Anthony Wayne because he had a drinking problem. Now, folk, when I was 9 years old, until shortly after my 11th birthday, I lived in a little town in southern Pennsylvania called Waynesboro. Waynesboro is named after Anthony Wayne, and Waynesboro is where Anthony Wayne grew up as a boy. Anyway, Anthony Wayne was sent from Waynesboro out west, and he engaged the Indians also at a place called Fallen Timbers because a tornado had hit the area and knocked down a whole lot of trees. That's why it was called Fallen Timbers. Anthony Wayne had studied the Indians, and he knew the Indians would not eat before a fight. Now, folk, in some ways it's a good idea because coaches of football teams would tell their players, don't eat after a certain point before a big game. I mean, I see one head nodding. Basketball players, same thing, don't eat don't drink milk products until after a certain time before the big game. Eating will make you sluggish, eating certain foods. But the Indians would not eat before a fight. Well, Anthony Wayne pretended he was going to fight, but then he'd withdraw. He'd start again to pretend he was going to fight or withdraw. Meantime, his men were eating. The Indians were not. This went on for 10 days, but this time the Indians were too weak to fight. Then he attacked them and actually fought them. He won. Mad Anthony Wayne won the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And the Indians were very much discouraged. Well, Anthony Wayne said to the Indians, now, hey, I've got an offer to you. We'll let you live in this territory, and we'll give you, so that you can subsist, we'll give you gifts from every year. And they'd give the Indians things like blankets and hatchets. Now, folk, there are persons who have said, I heard this recently, that they would give the Indians blankets that they knew people with smallpox had used in an attempt to deliberately give the Indians smallpox. I don't know how true this is, but one thing they did give the Indians that really hurt them, they gave the Indians whiskey. Now, folk, if you think I'm being racial, I'm not going to apologize for this. I saw when I was in the Army, and I've heard it all my life. Oriental peoples, and the Indians are believed to be of Oriental origin, Oriental peoples have no business drinking alcoholic drinks. I see one head up. The effect it has on them is actually tragic. Would be hilarious. But I was in the Army with an Oriental man from Hawaii who drank one day. He came back to the barracks, and he couldn't even remember his combination to his locker. So the men had to help. He couldn't get the other men around him had to help him undress. He couldn't even undress himself. And they put him in bed, and they took his uniform and put his uniform in their lockers, I mean, parts of his uniform, to where the sergeants wouldn't catch his uniform, because we were not allowed to keep our uniforms outside our lockers. But he couldn't open his own locker. And he went around just shouting obscenities and cussing at every one of us. The next morning he woke up and he remembered what he apologized to all of us. Ooh, I made a dunce out of myself last night. But anyway, point I'm making is the Indians, the effect of whiskey on them was just utterly debilitating. Now here's one law that they made for the Indians, still in the books. Now if you're an American Indian, you can go to any of the public lakes and fish without a license. That's still on the books. Now if you're an American Indian, you can go in the woods and hunt. Anyone else who wants to go hunting during hunting season has to get a license. If you're an American Indian, you don't. That law, as far as I know, is still on the books. The Indians can hunt in this country and can fish without a license, and a lot of them do. They go out in their canoes, but even the Indians are not allowed to go in the water at night without lights. So, folks, don't try that. So, if you go go out in the water at night, you must have lights on your boat, even if it's a canoe. Not even the Indians will do that. But anyway, the Indians fought, and as usual, lost. Morally, they were on high ground, but the other side of it is the fighting was suicide. They were hopelessly outnumbered by this point, and they had no chance at all to win. All right. At first, all right, everybody had to buy 640 acres. So if you wanted to go to Ohio in the late 1700s, you had to buy 640 acres. Well, most men couldn't afford it. The land was cheap, $1 an acre, 640 bucks. Very, very few colonials had that kind of money. But speculators bought some land, and they would sell it then in piecemeal. Now, how much is 640 acres? It's 1 mile by 1 mile by 1 mile. 1 mile square. That is a lot of land. More land than an ordinary farmer can farm, especially when you have nothing but a mule. And more land than most people needed. And you could not buy it on credit either. Now today, I mean, if you want to buy land, I mean, you can go to a bank and get a bank loan and buy the land on a 30-year loan. But in those days, there was no system of credit. So eventually, they allowed people to buy less and less land until eventually you could buy as much land as you needed. And if you might not, an acre of land is a good sized plot of land. An acre, let's see, I'd say the distance between this building and that E building over there inclusive would be just about an acre. If you, maybe it's a little bit more than that, but an acre is a sizable plot of land, and most farmers who had nobody but their wife and children to help them farm, most farmers in those days could not even farm 1 acre. All right. Anyway, slavery right away was forbidden in these territories. The first state west of the Appalachians was Ohio in the late 1700s, followed by Kentucky and Tennessee that came shortly after Ohio. Both of them were states before 1800. Indiana and Illinois eventually followed as being states. Michigan and Wisconsin 5 states were made out of the Northwest Territory. Not Minnesota. Minnesota is west of the Mississippi River. That was to come later. There was a rebellion that occurred in Massachusetts called Shays' Rebellion. The rebellion was led by Daniel Shays. The Shays' Rebellion, a lot of the issue was land. But where it's important, I mean, I won't go into detail about what caused it, but the rebellion was eventually put down. A lot of the leaders fled. No one was executed. But the rich people were scared because they thought, hey, the problem is the central government cannot protect our lands. Shays' Rebellion was a rebellion of the poor, of whom Shay was one, against the rich. And a lot of the rich people feared that, hey, the central government is not enough to protect us. And they began to want a more powerful government. Now, folk, 2,300 years ago, there was a Greek philosopher who said when people are given too much freedom, after a while they start demanding a stronger government. This man's name was Socrates. Hopefully all of you probably have heard of him. But Socrates said that at the Athens he saw, the animals would not even obey their masters unless they wanted to. The children were free from their parents. Wives would go out without their husband's consent or knowledge. And in Socrates' case, he'd get up every day and his wife would go one way, he'd go another. He never, or rarely ever knew where she went, and she didn't know where he went. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying his wife was unfaithful. No one has ever accused her of that, and I'm not going to. But he said that what happens under a situation like that, people get to where they start demanding there be more order. And in our country, well, in Latin America today, gangs control the country. And even the elected officials have to get permission from gangs in order to operate. And a lot of people are concerned because these type of people, including members of gangs, might be coming here. And that's an issue that's still going on, a hot issue. And, well, all right, one Latin American country just late last year elected a new president named Brazil. And the Brazilian new president said, I'm going to stop the gang activity and I'm going to jail all criminals. And said even if I have to put them on ships and anchor the ships miles out in the ocean, they're going to all be put in jail regardless. And he got the vote. He got the vote. I don't know if any of you are from Brazil or not, but maybe some of you in that part of the world. But this Brazilian president is determined he's going to bring law and order to this country and quelch the gangs. We'll see how well he does. All right. But anyway, Shays' Rebellion was a rebellion that made the central government look weak. Finally, they got together and decided we have to have a constitution. This is not working. So they got together and made the constitution. They went from Annapolis first to Philadelphia. And from Philadelphia, they drew up the Constitution we have today. The plan of Constitution that we've drawn today was drawn up by James Madison. It was debated on, but finally, they learned to compromise, and our Constitution today is called a bundle of compromises. Now, one of the more famous compromises, it's called the Great Compromise. It's where senators, each state gets 2 senators, no matter how big the state is. But the House of Representatives is set proportional to population. In other words, states like California that have more people than other states, they send more representatives than smaller states like Rhode Island that doesn't have as many people as California has. So you're a smaller state, but each state, some states only have 1 representative. They don't have that many people living in them. Some states have 20 or 30, like New York and California. Does anybody know, and I don't, how many representatives does Georgia have? It seems like it's about 10. 10 or 11, something like that, maybe 12. None of you know, I don't either. But Georgia has an average number of representatives. Again, geographically, after Virginia split in 2 during the Civil War, Georgia is the largest state east of the Mississippi River. Slightly bigger than New York, but it's not the most populous. but Georgia is growing in population. Some of the other states aren't. New York, for instance, is losing people. But anyway, in the Senate, it's 2 senators for each state. In the House, it's proportional. Another compromise is called the famous or infamous 3/5 compromise. The southern states wanted their slaves to count as people when it came to representative purposes. In other words, let's count our slave people for representative purposes, but not for tax purposes. The North said, no, wait a minute, that's not fair. If you're going to count them for one, count them for both, or don't count them at all for any. Well, they finally worked out a compromise to where every slave would count as 3/5 of a person. In other words, every 5 slaves would count as 3 persons. And for both taxation and representation. Even though no slave was ever sent to Congress to represent them until after the Civil War. But nevertheless, slaves did count as 3/5 of a person. So the southern states got, even though South Carolina had more blacks than it did whites, more slaves probably did free people. The slaves did count some for representation and for tax purposes both. That's the famous 3/5 compromise. Now, the word slave is never used in the Constitution. They call slaves such persons or other persons. And I can quote one clause in the Constitution. Until the year 1808, that is, until the year 1808, such persons may be imported from abroad. But after the year 1808, such persons or other persons may not be imported from abroad. That means the slave trade was outlawed after the year 1808, which, by the way, did come to pass. Slavery itself was not illegal. Basically, the Constitution condoned slavery, and this was to lead to Garrison, a man named Garrison, many years later, calling the Constitution an agreement with death and a covenant with hell. George Washington presided over the meeting, but he said little, but he tried to keep order during the meeting. Ben Franklin was there. Now, some things they worked out in the Constitution. Hopefully, the lower house, the House of Representatives, was elected every 2 years. Now, I really believe that if they'd have had our transportation, our jet aircraft, our internet, and our telephones, and our cell phones, they would probably have elected their representative every year. But most of your states were holding elections every year at this time. And the idea of holding elections every year meant this. Nobody became very powerful. A politician who got elected had to spend a lot of his time making sure he was reelected, and a lot of them fell out of favor. And also the people at that time felt like, we only want a man to serve for 1 year, then get him out. Serve for a year and get him out. Now, I must say this, folks. The idea of a career politician, the Founding Fathers did not dream of. They wanted a man who served, who had been successful in whatever occupation he chose, and then maybe serve in Congress for 1 year and then leave, or serve as even president or governor for 1 year and leave. The nearest president we've ever had since George Washington who meets that criteria that the Founding Fathers had, not Bill Clinton, who was nothing but a career politician. That's not to slander the man. All he ever had done was be a politician all of his life. That's not what I found out. The nearest man we've had is Donald Trump. A man who had never been in politics, and he's the only president who had never served in any capacity in politics and never been in the army at all. And all of a sudden one day he's president of the United States. This is what our Founding Fathers actually had in mind. And serve a few years. The Congress, House of Representatives served 2 years. The President 4 years, and the Senate 6 years. Now, last year we had an election, and in that election we elected all members of the House. We elected 1/3 of our senators. That means that this last election we elected 1/3. In 2020 we'll elect another 1/3 of our senators, and in 2022 we'll elect another 1/3. That way every 6 years every senator has to face the election again. The Senate is looked on as being the upper house, the House of the lower house. Because it was this way in England, all tax bills must originate in the U.S. House of Representatives. The Senate cannot originate. Now, the Senate does not have to approve of what the House passes. The House will pass a tax bill, and then the Senate can either disapprove or approve of it. But nevertheless, the Senate cannot originate a tax bill. They must originate in the House. All right. Now, you had some people who, and I'm running out of time fast, who did not like the Constitution. They became known as the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were for the Constitution, the One reason the Anti-Federalists did not like the Constitution, it did not include a Bill of Rights. To get the Constitution ratified, they had to promise that the Bill of Rights would be added. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And they were added. Now, about the Bill of Rights, I want to say this. First Amendment includes the right to petition, the right to peaceful assembly, and it says that Congress shall make no law respecting any religion. Then it says, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And that part about prohibiting the free exercise thereof, that's been attacked in recent years. Amendment number 2, you must know this. Amendment number 2, the right to bear arms. A lot of persons are against Amendment number 2 today. And Georgia had, in its last election, a candidate who did not win for governor promised to take all of our guns away if this candidate were elected. The Supreme Court a few years ago ruled that the Second Amendment still applies. Private citizens have a right to arm themselves, to defend themselves, still yet. Now, I'll tell you, one of the most notorious persons in modern times who favored gun control, who took away the gunsmiths people, was a German leader named Adolf. Adolf Hitler, once he signed a bill outlawing weapons, said that all crime will come to an end. He was wrong. He said with this bill, he got the power to kill 15 million persons who were defenseless to fight against him. 6 million of them were Jews. He killed a higher percentage of gypsies than he did Jews, only because they were gypsy. The Jews, only because they were Jews. Again, he might have been more hesitant. The gun folk did a lot in Europe to decrease the power of the nobility. At one time, only the nobles had armor and had horses and had swords and lances and spears. Your common men had nothing. Then came the invention of the longbow, then the crossbow. A common man with a crossbow could kill a lord in armor. A common serf with a gun could kill a lord, and this meant that the serfs got more and more freedom and power as time went on at the expense of the nobility. Again, you might can guess which side I'm on in that issue. Carry guns. All right. There are other laws in the Bill of Rights, but I'm running out of time. Before I close, I want to say this. Was the United States a Christian country? This was asked in a book, and the book points out that a lot of persons did not want Catholics, Jews, and foreigners to hold office, even though Alexander Hamilton himself was a foreigner born in the West Indies. But they have this law is still in the Constitution. A man who is not naturally born citizen of the United States cannot be president. That's still on the books. Henry Kissinger was born in Germany. He was not allowed to be president. Foreigners are kept from serving in a lot of capacities. As for Catholics and Jews, again, folk, I know some of our, I do not in any way make it sound like promoting anti-Catholic sentiment, but the fact is our country did have a strong anti-Catholic sentiment throughout much of its history, and I don't want to sweep it under the rug, but I don't want to overemphasize it either, but it was there. A lot of persons did not want Catholics to hold office, and for many years in a lot of places Catholics couldn't. Now lately we've had a Catholic president during my lifetime. We've had 2 other Catholics run for president. They lost. When my mother was a young girl, about 6 years old, we had a Catholic run for president, Al Smith by name. We'll talk about him later. He lost, but Al Smith got more votes than he otherwise would have. In Al Smith's day, the Republicans could not be beaten at that time. The Republicans had control. So the Democrats ran Al Smith, and Al Smith got more votes probably than any other Democrat could have gotten. owing to the fact he got the immigrant votes and the Catholic vote, and a lot of votes from the very poor. And Al Smith had a habit of, he'd remind the country of what a politician said. All right, this politician promised. Now let's look at the record and point out what that politician had not done. And one of the most notorious politicians I've ever seen for not keeping his promises was Jimmy Carter. Hey, it's un-American, it's un-Georgian of you to say that. Well, I mean, prove me wrong by the facts. Politicians, it's easy to make promises, and a lot of times they won't keep them. Now, there were restrictions at one time that a person had to be a church member to hold office. I'll say this about to close. But that law was taken off the books. Even though for many generations every politician was a church member. Only recently have we had politicians come forth and say they're atheist, or even one recently came forth and said he's Islamic. Very rarely, but it does happen these days. But for many generations, the law might not have said you had to be a church member to be a politician, but all of our politicians were. And again, this was because of the nature of the country. Our country is fast changing. All right, with that, I'm going to close.